Phyllis's and whomever. Today we're at Brook Green Gardens, and Phyllis is going to tell you about what we're going to do.
We're going on a trekker ride. All that I know about it is it's bumpy. And we're going to have some kind of a tour.
It does involve traveling over rough terrain, so seat belts are required. We are going to be bouncing around a bit out there. Also, we're going to be very close to trees and vegetation while we're out here. The trails are very narrow, so you might even need to lean in a time or two. Former rice plantations, which begin down on the south end of our property, just below the Welcome Center with the Oaks Plantation. The property that we're on right now, the area that makes up the sculpture gardens, the zoo, the walking trails, the picnic area, all that sort of stuff. This is what was Brook Green Gardens. And then as we head north, Springfield and Laurel Hill plantations, and that's where we're going and spending most of our time today. Now, all four of these plantations went bankrupt following the Civil War, when the rice economy eventually came to an end here in the early 1900s. And then in 1930, a couple named Archer and Anna Hyatt Huntington, a very wealthy couple from New York, came down here looking to build a winter home, and they needed a retreat where Anna Hyatt Huntington could recover from tuberculosis. And they bought this 9,127 acre tract of land. So obviously these people were very wealthy, they had a lot of money. Archer Huntington, his family had made a fortune in the coal, railroad, and shipping industries. Anna Hyatt Huntington was a world-renowned sculptor. Diamond-shaped pattern. Each of those cabins housed about 10 slaves, so if you do the math, there were about 500 slaves who were working on this plantation. Very big in terms of rice production and the number of slave labor used here. Were created by Native Americans long ago, the Indians. And then when the early settlers came here, they began using these same trails, as did the planters and even the slaves. So there's a lot of history on these old trails. And we have 31 miles of unpaved trails here on Brook Green property. You can see why our trails are so bumpy out here. Our grading equipment over here on the right hand side is a little out of date there. Several of them are in a couple of pens right up here on the left hand side. And let's have a peek in here and see where we can see if we can spot these guys. Okay, you can see one walking across the middle of the pen right over here. And I think there's a couple more up at the far end up there. There's there's another one, 3 of them right there in the center there. You can see 2 of them laying down and another one standing up. And then we have another pen right here, and you can look in there. You can see a couple of them out there walking around. The vegetation there is a little bit dense, so it's kind of tough to see through there, but you can see a few of them back there hanging out. And they have a pretty good life here. They're well protected. They get fed every day. They get medical attention if they need it. They would build these instead of fences or stone walls like you might see in other parts of the country. These have eroded quite a bit over the years. They're not as big as they once were and wouldn't have had all these trees growing on them. So this is the property line that separates Brook Green Plantation from Old Springfield Plantation. And we're going to begin driving across Springfield Plantation. It stretches from the ocean on our right to the Waccamaw River on our left. And you'll see that it's a pretty narrow tract of land, and that was typical of the plantations here along the Waccamaw Neck. Long, narrow tracts of land that stretch from the Atlantic to the Waccamaw River. And back then, it was the river end of the property that was the most important to these planters, because that's where they grew the rice in the swampland bordering the creeks and rivers off the west end of our property here. And they did a lot of their travel by boat in those days. So your big house, your plantation home, would be located on that end of the property, giving you access to the 4 large rivers and all of the creeks of the plantation. And right over here to our left, you'll begin seeing some of the old artificial flower arrangements and wreaths left over here. You can see these small rectangular metal markers here in the brush here marking grave sites, and then of course you can see those headstones back over there on the back side. And as we drive up through here, there are quite a few scattered amongst the trees and brush out here, but the vegetation's pretty dense this time of year. You can see one straight back there in that sunny area, and then we have several coming into plain sight up here on your left hand side. And this cemetery is a very rare site because it is active. It's still being used today. There are descendants of slaves living in the area who can be buried here. Your last burial took place here in 2001. And you may wonder why an active cemetery would look like this, but this is how the African slaves preferred their cemetery, in a rural, spiritually rich environment, usually out in the woods. They didn't alter the landscape in any way. They didn't cut down trees. They didn't build a fence or a wall around it. Theirs had a very random, natural look to it. That's how the rest of the country. And this was home to some of the wealthiest people in the United States. Why so much rice here in Georgetown, of all places, when you had a perfect storm here for growing rice? Thousands of acres of swampland running along the coastline here. The soil in those swamps is very fertile, good for growing rice. The weather here obviously is warm, and then the creeks and rivers that flow through those swamps out there are tidal creeks and rivers. They rise and fall with the ocean tides each day. You have a 3 or 4 foot tide that occurs twice a day here. The planters would utilize the rising tides to flood their rice fields and irrigate them. And so Mother Nature provided them with a built-in water supply and irrigation system. And then finally, the slaves who did the work here came from West Africa, which was known as the Grain or Gold Coast. Springfield Plantation wasn't very wide, but most of the acreage is in the length of the property. It's about 3 miles from the ocean to the river. Okay, next up is the area where the plantation home was located. And this one is no longer here. It was torn down in the 1930s when the Huntingtons got here because it was in such disrepair. But the dead giveaway that it was here is the beautiful plantation driveway you see on the left-hand side here. And this is a classic example of the old southern plantation driveways that you see so much of today throughout the South. The driveways lined with big live oak trees. There are huge branches in the Spanish moss creating this canopy over the driveway here. And when you walk through the main walkway of the sculpture gardens, it is lined with big live oaks, and that was the driveway leading to the plantation home there at Brook Green, which was on the backside of the sculpture gardens. That house unfortunately burned down back in 1901, and as a matter of fact, all 4 plantation homes here are gone. The only structure that is still standing today, left over from the plantation era, is the old kitchen out in the sculpture gardens, which provided food for that home. And it's good for them. They blend in with Mother Nature, and especially good for them when they have little babies tagging along, and females are typically a bit smaller than the males. But you see a lot of those here on Brook Green property. They're all over the place. Really surprised we haven't seen another one on this trip so far. Okay, over here to your left, this is the Waccamaw River. This is part of the Intracoastal Waterway System, and it's named after an Indian tribe, the Waccamaw Indians. And it's popular with local boaters, jet skiers, and fishermen. And then you have people who travel up and down the coast in their yachts and sailboats, houseboats and things, viewing the country from a different perspective. The land over there is actually an island, Sandy Island. It has the Waccamaw River on this side of it, the PD River on the other side of it. And it's one of the largest river islands east of the Mississippi River. It's about 6 miles long and up to 4 miles wide. And it's a very historic island. It was home to 9 rice plantations. And today, descendants of the slaves who worked on those plantations still live on the south end of that island. About 85 people at last count. They were deeded land there following the Civil War and have been over there ever since. 17 and 1800s, it was originally brought here by the Spanish, it's believed, back in the 1500s. And the way they made this was to burn oyster shells down to a fine powder, mix it with whole oyster shells, sand, and water, and it would create this concrete-like material that you see. And we don't know what this was used for. It's too small to be a living quarter of any sort, so possibly a storage shed, a smokehouse, or maybe even just a watering trough for the horses and cattle. 15-foot-tall rice mill chimney or mill stack. And it's one of only 4 still standing here in the area. It survived that fire and a number of storms, and this incidentally was constructed by the slaves. I mentioned earlier that many of them were skilled craftsmen, and as you can see, this is a good example of that. These brick masons did a tremendous job on this. This has been here since the 1800s. Okay, I'm first going to swing to the left, so you guys sitting over there on the right can get a good look at this, and then I'll swing around for everybody to see. The fatty acid would spoil the rice on a long trip overseas. And so they had to mill the rice, and in the early years, the slaves did this work by hand with a mortar and pestle. It was a time-consuming process that oftentimes created a bottleneck on the plantation. because you could grow rice faster than you could mill it. And they needed a solution, and it came in the form of the rice mill, which was first water powered and then steam powered. And you can see that opening or flue on the left or back side of the chimney there. Extending out from that was a brick tunnel. And at the end of that brick tunnel was a 20-foot brick enclosure with a steel boiler inside of it, and that's where the mill was located. They would start a fire in a furnace at that end, a larger fire here at the base of the chimney, which would draw the hot gases beneath the boiler, boiling the water and creating steam, which powered the mill. The steam would be used to drive large millstones, which would roll together, and a conveyor would feed rice through there, cracking off the outer hull of the rice, and a series of piston-powered pestles pounded the rice and broke the bran off of it, converting brown rice into white rice and getting rid of that bran layer that could spoil the rice. Slaves who worked for the Westons. These headstones, though, were not placed here or by their family or descendants like the ones we saw in the previous cemetery. These were actually placed here by the plantation owner at the time, Francis Marion Weston, and this was unusual. Rice planters did not typically do this for their slaves, but as I mentioned earlier, the Westons did have this reputation. And these were two personal servants of theirs, Frank on the left, or Saunders on the left, Frank on the right. They both died in 1848.